There was an atmosphere and a constant atmospheric flow from bright side to dark side. Not much. The lighter gases had reached escape velocity and disappeared from bright side millennia ago, but there was CO2 and nitrogen and traces of other heavier gases. There was also an abundance of sulfur vapor, as well as carbon disulfide and sulfur dioxide. The atmospheric tide moved toward the dark side, where it condensed, carrying enough volcanic ash with it for Sanderson to estimate the depth and nature of the surface upheavals on Brightside from his samplings. The trick was to find a passage that avoided those upheavals as far as possible. But in the final analysis, we were barely scraping the surface. The only way we could find out what was happening where was to be there. Finally, on the third day, McIvors blew in on a freight rocket from Venus. He'd missed the ship that the Major and I had taken by a few hours, and had conned his way to Venus in hopes of getting a hop from there. He didn't seem too upset about it, as though this were his usual way of doing things and he couldn't see why everyone should get so excited. He was a tall, rangy man, with long wavy hair prematurely gray, and the sort of eyes that looked like a climber's, half closed, sleepy, almost indolent, but capable of abrupt alertness. And he never stood still; he was always moving, always doing something with his hands, or talking, or pacing about. Evidently the Major decided not to press the issue of his arrival. There was still work to do, and an hour later we were running the final tests on the pressure suits. That evening Stone and McIvors were thick as thieves, and everything was set for an early departure after we got some rest. "And that," said Barron, finishing his drink and signaling the waiter for another pair, "was your first big mistake." Peter Claney raised his eyebrows. "McIvors?" "Of course." Claney shrugged, glanced at the small quiet tables around them. "There are lots of bizarre personalities around a place like this, and some of the best wouldn't seem to be the most reliable at first glance. Anyway, personality problems weren't our big problem right then. Equipment worried us first and our route next." Barron nodded in agreement. "What kind of suits did you have?" "The best insulating suits ever made," said Claney. "Each one had an inner lining of fiberglass modification to avoid the clumsiness of asbestos, and carried the refrigerating unit and oxygen storage which we recharged from the sledges every 8 hours. Outer layers carried a monomolecular chrome reflecting surface that made us glitter like Christmas trees. And we had a half-inch dead air space under positive pressure between the two layers. Warning thermocouples, of course, at 770 degrees. It wouldn't take much time to fry us to cinders if the suits failed somewhere." "How about the bugs?" "They were insulated too, but we weren't counting on them too much for protection." "You weren't?" exclaimed Barron. "Why not?" "We'd be in and out of them too much. They gave us mobility and storage, but we knew we'd have to do a lot of forward work on foot." Claney smiled bitterly. "Which meant that we had an inch of fiberglass and half-inch of dead air between us and a surface temperature where the lead flowed like water and zinc was almost at melting point and the pools of sulfur in the shadows were boiling like oatmeal over a campfire." Barron licked his lips. His fingers stroked the cool, wet glass as he set it down on the tablecloth. "Go on," he said tautly. "You started on schedule?" "Oh, yes," said Claney. "We started on schedule all right. We just didn't quite end on schedule, that was all. But I'm getting to that." He settled back in his chair and continued. "We jumped off from Twilight on a course due southeast with 30 days to make it to the center of Brightside. If we could cross an average of 70 miles a day, we could hit center exactly at perihelion, the point of Mercury's closest approach to the sun, which made center the hottest part of the planet at the hottest it ever gets. The sun was already huge and yellow over the horizon when we started, twice the size it appears on Earth. Every day that sun would grow bigger and whiter, and every day the surface would get hotter. But once we reached center, the job was only half done. We would still have to travel another 2,000 miles to the opposite twilight zone. Sanderson was to meet us on the other side in the laboratory scout ship, approximately 60 days from the time we jumped off. That was the plan, in outline. It was up to us to cross those 70 miles a day, no matter how hot it became, no matter what terrain we had to cross. Detours would be dangerous and time-consuming. Delays could cost us our lives. We all knew that. The major briefed us on details an hour before we left. "Peter, you take the lead bug, the small one we stripped down for you. Stone and I will flank you on either side, giving you a 100-yard lead. McIvers, you'll have the job of dragging the sledges, so we'll have to direct your course pretty closely. Peter's job is to pick the passage at any given point. If there's any doubt of safe passage, we all explore ahead on foot before we risk the bugs. Got that?" McIvers and Stone exchanged glances. McIvers said, "Jack and I are planning to change around. We figured he could take the sledges. That would give me a little more mobility." The major looked up sharply at Stone. "Do you buy that, Jack?" Stone shrugged. "I don't mind. Mac wanted." McIvers made an impatient gesture with his hands. "It doesn't matter. I just feel better when I'm on the move. Does it make any difference?" "I guess it doesn't," said the major. "Then you'll flank Peter along with me, right?" Sure. McIvers pulled at his lower lip. "Who's going to do the advance scouting?" "It sounds like I am," I cut in. "We want to keep the lead bug as light as possible." Macuda nodded. "That's right. Peter's bug is stripped down to the frame and wheels." McIvers shook his head. "No, I mean the advance work. You need somebody out ahead, 4 or 5 miles at least, to pick up the big flaws and active surface changes, don't you?" He stared at the major. "I mean, how can we tell what sort of a hole we may be moving into, unless we have a scout up ahead?" "That's what we have the charts for," the major said sharply. "Charts? I'm talking about detail work. We don't need to worry about the major topography. It's the little faults you can't see on the pictures that can kill us." He tossed the charts down excitedly. "Look, let me take a bug out ahead and work reconnaissance. Keep 5, maybe 10 miles ahead of the column. I can stay on good solid ground, of course, but scan the area closely and radio back to Peter where to avoid the flaws. Then—" "No dice," the major broke in. "But why not? We could save ourselves days." "I don't care what we could save. We stay together. When we get to the center, I want live men along with me. That means we stay within easy sight of each other at all times. Any climber knows that everybody is safer in a party than one man alone. Any time, any place." McIvers stared at him, his cheeks an angry red. Finally he gave a sullen nod. "Okay, if you say so." "Well, I say so and I mean it. I don't want any fancy stuff. We're going to hit center together, and finish the crossing together. Got that?" McIvers nodded. Macuda then looked at Stone and me and we nodded too. "All right," he said slowly. "Now that we've got it straight, let's go." It was hot. If I forget everything else about that trek, I'll never forget that huge yellow sun glaring down, without a break, hotter and hotter with every mile. We knew that the first few days would be the easiest, and we were rested and fresh when we started down the long ragged gorge southeast of the Twilight Lab. I moved out first. Back over my shoulder I could see the major and McIvers crawling out behind me, their pillow tires taking the rugged floor of the gorge smoothly. Behind them Stone dragged the sledges. Even at only 30% earth gravity they were a strain on the big tractor, until the ski blades bit into the fluffy volcanic ash blanketing the valley. We even had a path to follow for the first 20 miles. I kept my eyes pasted to the big Polaroid binocs. picking out the track the early research teams had made out into the edge of Brightside. But in a couple of hours we rumbled past Sanderson's little outpost observatory and the track stopped. We were in virgin territory and already the sun was beginning to bite. We didn't feel the heat so much those first days out. We saw it. The refrig units kept our skins at a nice, comfortable 75 degrees Fahrenheit inside our suits, but our eyes watched that glaring sun and the baked yellow rocks going past, and some nerve pathways got twisted up somehow. We poured sweat as if we were in a superheated furnace. We drove 8 hours and slept 5. When a sleep period came due, we pulled the bugs together into a square, threw up a light aluminum sunshield and lay out in the dust and rocks. The sunshield cut the temperature down 60 or 70 degrees, for whatever help that was. And then we ate from the forward sledge, sucking through tubes, protein, carbohydrates, bulk gelatin, vitamins. The major measured water out with an iron hand, because we'd have drunk ourselves into nephritis in a week otherwise. We were constantly, unceasingly thirsty. Ask the physiologists and psychiatrists why. They can give you half a dozen interesting reasons, but we all knew, or cared about, was that it happened to be so. We didn't sleep the first few stops as a consequence. Our eyes burned in spite of the filters and we had roaring headaches, but we couldn't sleep them off. We sat around looking at each other. Then MacGyvers would say how good a beer would taste, and off we'd go. We'd have murdered our grandmothers for one ice-cold bottle of beer. After a few driving periods, I began to get my bearings at the wheel. We were moving down into desolation that made Earth's old Death Valley look like a Japanese rose garden. Huge sun-baked cracks opened up in the floor of the gorge, with black cliffs jutting up on either side. The air was filled with a barely visible yellowish mist of sulfur and sulphurous gases. It was a hot, barren hole, no place for any man to go, but the challenge was so powerful you could almost feel it. No one had ever crossed this land before and escaped. Those who had tried it had been cruelly punished, but the land was still there, so it had to be crossed. Not the easy way, it had to be crossed the hardest way possible, overland, through anything the land could throw up to us, at the most difficult time possible. Yet we knew that even the land might have been conquered before, except for that sun. We fought absolute cold before and won. We'd never fought heat like this and won. The only worse heat in the solar system was the surface of the sun itself. Brightside was worth trying for. We would get it or it would get us. That was the bargain. I learned a lot about Mercury those first few driving periods. The gorge petered out after 100 miles and we moved onto the slope of a range of ragged craters that ran south and east. This range had no activity since the first landing on Mercury 40 years before, but beyond it there were active cones. Yellow fumes rose from the craters constantly. Their sides were shrouded with heavy ash. We couldn't detect a wind, but we knew there was a hot, sulphurous breeze sweeping in great continental tides across the surface of the planet. Not enough for erosion, though. The craters rose up out of jagged gorges, huge towering spears of rock and rubble. Below were the vast yellow flatlands, smoking and hissing from the gases beneath the crust. Over everything was gray dust, silicates and salts, pumice and limestone and granite ash, filling crevices and declivities, offering a soft, treacherous surface for the bug pillow tires. I learned to read the ground, to tell a covered fault by the sag of the dust. I learned to spot a passable crack, and tell it from an impassable cut. Time after time the bugs ground to a halt while we explored a passage on foot, tied together with a light copper cable, digging, advancing, digging some more until we were sure the surface could carry the machines. It was cruel work. We slept in exhaustion, but it went smoothly at first. Too smoothly, it seemed to me, and the others seemed to think so too. McIver's restlessness was